I used to teach acting classes in New York City, and one of the most common issues that my students would run into is that no matter how much preparation they had done, they'd get up in front of the class and they'd freeze. Their breath would get tight, their bodies tense, and invariably the first few moments of that scene would feel forced and ineffectual. And so this led me to one of my favorite actor notes I've ever given, which is, the problem is, you're trying to start the scene. That's a terrible amount of pressure to put on yourself to start a whole human life from scratch. So the solution is, before you speak, listen. Listen to your partner. Listen to the audience. Listen to the very world around you. See that, in fact, life has already begun. Admire its complexity. Allow it to affect you. And then respond. And voila, the magic of listening as the gateway to powerful, effective action. Now, that was acting class. Meanwhile, back in the real world, I spent most of the last 18 months or so in various pandemic quarantines and lockdowns, paralyzed. Breath held, body tense. It works. I was fretting about or numbing myself to the huge problems we are facing as a society. Climate change, systemic racism. How do we help people who have been hurt by this ongoing pandemic? Where do we even start with all this stuff? And there it was. Did you catch it? That pressure to start. Sneaky. And so I decided to take my own advice, scariest thing of all, right? And listen. And I'll be honest, at first it only felt like it added to my anxiety. Just more preparation that I had to get right, But pretty soon, that gateway to effective, powerful action began to open up, and that's what I'm here to do with you. I'm here to walk you up to that same gateway. If you are someone who wants to alleviate suffering, if you want to save lives, if you want to make our society more just and more fair, and you don't quite know where to start, I'm here with the surprisingly powerful answer to addressing and tackling those major issues, and hint, hint, it's a lot closer than you think. It's local democracy! Surprise! Thank you, thank you. You can act like you saw this reveal coming because of the intro, but unless you are one of the less than 30% of the residents of Washington State who voted in last August's primary election, this is news you can use. And that 30% figure, by the way, that is enough to make you above average. Less than 10% of the residents of Dallas, Texas voted in their municipal elections this past May, and nationwide, the average for turnout in local elections is about 27%. So, plenty of room for improvement. Local democracy, local government. Somehow the least probable, yet most surprising solution I can offer you today. But it's true. It is the most powerful vehicle we have for making people's lives better. And I'm not just saying this as an armchair optimist. Last year, during dips in pandemic cases, I put more than 12,000 miles on my car to talk to people who are running for or serving in local offices all over the country. I really wanted to meet them in their contexts, I wanted to see what color the dirt is where they are. I wanted to sample the best treats in their town. I really wanted to listen to the problems that people are facing right there in that area from their own mouths and hear how they're working together to address them. And I'm here to tell you that these local reps that I talk to, these are the dopest people I have ever met in my life. Put a pin in that for later. Now, you might think like I used to think. Our problems are too big. They're national. They're global. If we work at the local level, we'll never get there. But how can we have a just country if we have unjust states? Unjust cities? How can we have a just America if we have an unjust Seattle? Local government is where civil rights either get defended or they get destroyed. For instance, people ask all the time what the president is going to do about police violence in America. Well, with all due respect to that office, it isn't really his jurisdiction. The man who murdered George Floyd was a municipal employee. So it was the officer here in Seattle who, at a protest over that murder, arrested a man by kneeling on his neck. and the officers who were the subjects of more than 17,000 complaints of excessive violence here in Seattle alone at last summer's protests. Now, racist police violence is a national epidemic, and it is so horrifying that it sparked global protest. But it is fundamentally a local problem. That means if you, specifically you, here, my Seattle friends, if you don't think that's okay, you are literally the only ones who can do something about it. And this is where listening comes into play. So decisions about voter registration and voter access are made at the local and state level. And in a democracy, your vote is your voice. It is how we express what we need and what we value. And the systems we create through our democracy cater to the people whose voices get heard, who can express what they need and value. And it exploits the people whose voices don't get heard. I'm going to say that again, because it is literally that crucial and key. The only reason we deny people a voice and a vote in our government is so that we can exploit them for the benefit of others. For evidence about this, you need look no further than the economic data on groups that have historically been denied the right to vote. How does the wealth of Black Americans, who had no federally recognized right to vote until 1870, and whose right to vote and access to that right were continued to be curtailed by state-level laws and constitutions for generations after, how does the wealth of Black Americans compare to the wealth of white Americans? How about indigenous Americans who had no right to vote, were not even US citizens with a right to vote until 1924, and who still had no right whatsoever to vote in various states until the 1960s? You'll notice that question mark. That is because the federal government stopped measuring the wealth of Native communities in America in the year 2000, and they didn't stop measuring because there was so much of it. So, how did it look the last time we checked? We all know the fundamental equation of a democracy. One person equals one vote. We know it by heart, simple. What we don't often recognize is that the contrapositive is also true. If you do not have a vote, you are not recognized as a person. It is that simple, and it is that chilling. How does this country treat incarcerated people, almost none of whom are allowed to vote? With humanity, would you say? Now, I don't usually bust out my penchant for statistical analysis, but I have done some number crunching, and I have calculated the ideal percentages for voter registration and voter participation for every state and city in this country. So, if you brought a pad of paper and a pencil to this TED Talk, first of all, nice. Second of all, now it's time to get that out because I'm going to share those numbers with you. Ready? Because anything less than that, and you have to ask, who are we leaving out? And how are we exploiting them due to their absence? If we invite them to speak, what systemic abuses are we afraid they'll reveal? Are we willing to ask who is benefiting from their silence? And are we ready to admit that it's us? These are emotional questions, but this is where we are. So, is your city, your state, at those numbers? No? Well, then there's still work to do. But there's good news, and the good news is that people have already started this work. In every state in the union, there are people who are fighting for every voice in the community to get heard, which is amazing because that takes the pressure off of you to have to start anything. All you got to do is listen, find out who they are and what they need for support. For instance, did you know that Washington State just last year elected its first ever formerly incarcerated person to the State House of Representatives? This is a population that had never been represented in government here before and have been utterly dehumanized. And since Tara Simmons took office, Washington passed a law that automatically restores the right to vote upon leaving prison immediately. That is a big deal. And yeah, yes. And there is still a ways to go, but this is a significant step towards recognizing more humanity in government. Red states and blue states, and rural areas and urban areas all have major blind spots, but they all have people who are fighting tooth and nail for more humanity in government. Also last year, in 2020, after being elected as the Pima County Recorder, Gabriela Cazares-Kelly became the first Indigenous woman to hold a county-wide office in the state of Arizona. Having grown up on the Thon-Autham Reservation, Gabriela is well aware of the systemic barriers that Native people still face trying to vote in this country, especially in Arizona, a state where Native people didn't have a right to vote at all until 1948. 1948 is not ancient history. Gabriela's own grandmother, born in this country, did not have a right to vote until well into her adulthood. So Gabriela has taken a lifetime of listening to these issues and turned them into action. One of her first successes in office was reopening an early voting site on the Pasquayaqui Reservation that saves residents a more than 2-hour commute to the next nearest voting site. Talk about systemic barriers. Also last year in 2020, Maury Turner became the first non-binary person elected to any state legislature anywhere in the country, and they were elected in Oklahoma. They also became the first Muslim person to hold a state-level office in the Sooner State. And Maury Turner is awesome, super awesome. They're leading a conversation on justice, reimaginment, and rebuilding, and helping guide Oklahoma away from fines, fees, shame, and incarceration. Maury made it into office by knocking on doors, introducing themselves, and listening, and it worked. Maury's margin of victory? 248 votes. Yeah, every vote counts. Folks, a lot is possible, a lot, if you count every vote. There are people in every corner of every state who are fighting hard to get every voice heard. If you don't know who represents you on your city council, in your state legislature, on your school board, I want you to remedy that. Do some research, find out who they are and what they're fighting for, and then ask yourself some questions. Are they inspiring your faith in humanity? Because that's on the table. Are they fighting to make sure everyone in your community gets heard? If so, amazing. Do what you can to support them. Reach out, introduce yourself. Their job is hard, and your support is meaningful. If not, can you contact them and urge them to do better? If so, wow, great, do that. That's all lobbying is. It's not that hard. If not, if that doesn't work, can you find the person in your community who is fighting for those things and help them get elected instead? If so, great, do that. If not, if you can't find that person, are you ready to become that person? If so, congratulations. There are a lot of amazing organizations that exist to help people like you run. If you believe, like I do, that we are all in this together, local democracy is where we practice that belief. We have been leaving a lot of people out in this country for a long time, and that's not going to get better unless and until you take it personally that their exclusion is being maintained in your name. There are local elections happening somewhere in this country every week of the year, and our local representatives are taking their votes that shape our systems even more often than that. It's already begun. The best time for you to get involved is now. Thank you.